Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you today to Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes' lecture, Transformation Through Trauma, How Women Living with HIV/AIDS Survive Injuries of Inequality. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Berkeley Department of Sociology, Sociologists of Color and Allies, Social Science Matrix, and the Institute of Governmental Studies. A quick announcement before we begin. On October 25th at 12 p.m., Matrix is hosting a Matrix on Point event called New Directions in Studying Policing with primarily graduate student speakers, including our very own Kimberly Burke. Please check the Matrix and IGS websites and sign up for the newsletters to get updates on these events and many more. Okay, let me now introduce Xavier Durham, the lead organizer for Sociologists of Color and Allies, who will be introducing Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes. Xavier Durham is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Currently, his research focuses on private policing and the reproduction of inequality in the United States, with a particular interest in the changing landscape of contemporary security practices and the broader criminal justice system. Xavier has received funding from the National Science Foundation and is a current Berkeley Empirical Legal Studies Fellow in the Berkeley School of Law. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Xavier Durham for the introduction.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate that. So allow me to introduce our speaker. Celeste Watkins-Hayes is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Founding Director of the Center for Racial Justice at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. She is an internationally recognized scholar and expert, widely credited for her research at the intersection of inequality, public policy, and institutions, with a special focus on urban poverty, race, class, and gender studies. Dr. Watkins-Hayes has published 2 books, Remaking a Life, How Women Living with HIV/AIDS Confront Inequality, and The New Welfare Bureaucrats, Entanglements of Race, Class, and Policy Reform. She has won several distinguished book awards from the American Sociological Association, Eastern Sociological Society, Association for Humanist Sociology, the ASA section on sex and gender, the ASA section on race, gender, and class, as well as the Elliott Friedson Outstanding Publication Award and the Allison Pietmeyer Book Prize from the National Women's Studies Association. She has also published numerous articles in journals and edited volumes, and pieces in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Chicago Magazine. She has been widely quoted in the popular press as a national expert on social inequality, HIV/AIDS, and societal safety nets. Please join me in welcoming Professor Watkins-Hayes.
Thank you so much, Xavier, for that introduction. And Berkeley Sociology, it is an honor to be with you. It is my pleasure and treat. As I look on the screen, I just have to smile because I see so many people who I know from my various lives, whether I'm seeing Irene Blomrad from graduate school, Sibel Fox, and colleagues, Robert Braun from my time at Northwestern, and Ann Swidler, who I've been on panels on HIV. The list goes on and on. David Harding, great to see you. Alicia Shears, who worked on this project. So I could spend the entire time just going from box to box on Zoom and sharing how I know each of you, because I see so many friends and colleagues, and I just want to thank you for being here and thank you for supporting me throughout my career. It's really great to be with you here. So I am, without further ado, going to hop to my screen here. I'm at the point in my career where I'm really thinking about my overarching question in terms of what has been the link of all of my work so far. And I think that my driving question is the following: how do human beings improve their lives after individual structural institutional trauma, and what organizational systems and conditions best support transformative change? I'm really interested in thinking about this intersection between inequality and public policy, thinking about race, class, and gender, and looking at it through the lens of organizations. My first book, The New Welfare Bureaucrats, thought about that at the institutional level through the field work and interviews that I did with welfare offices in Massachusetts to understand dynamics within those organizations. And now Remaking a Life really focuses on systems and is really trying to understand how an organizational system, how an organizational network has come to pass such that it is truly helpful in helping people navigate trauma in ways that welfare offices that I studied previously, unfortunately, did not do. There's a really interesting dynamic that we have seen with the HIV epidemic that helps to center this guiding question. If you look on this slide here, you see what has happened as it relates to the HIV epidemic in the United States. So looking at the blue line, that may be the frame of how many of us thought about HIV, an illness that leads to death. We remember the time during the 1980s and 1990s where we saw rising what we now call stage 3 HIV-related deaths or AIDS-related deaths. And then we saw this marked decline that started to happen in 1995 with the introduction of highly active antiretroviral therapy, these life-saving medications that proved to be quite effective for people living with HIV and helping people live longer lives despite their HIV status. And you see the red line in terms of the uptick in what we've seen since, people living longer lives with HIV and now experiencing almost quote unquote normal life expectancies. Nevertheless, we know that there are disparities within the epidemic that continue to persist. We're still seeing about 40,000 new infections per year in the United States. And what's driving a lot of this are the inequities that I know many of us focus on in our work. So as you look at the groups most affected, HIV is largely an epidemic that is continues to impact the LGBTQ community, particularly gay men. You see, as we look intersectionally, the disparate impact that we're seeing for African-American and Latinx, gay and bisexual men, where they are the groups disproportionately represented in the epidemic. When we're looking at women, you see that Black women are the group of women most affected by HIV. So putting those two slides together, thinking about how is it that we're at a place in the epidemic where we now have the biomedical tools to end the HIV epidemic. We now have highly active antiretroviral therapy that can extend the lives of people living with HIV and can render their viral loads undetectable. What that means is that people living with HIV can't sexually transmit HIV if their viral loads are undetectable through the use of antiretroviral therapy. And we also are at an interesting point biomedically where we now have a preventive tool that is quite effective, and that is PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis. So that is for people who are HIV negative, who can take those medications and prevent HIV acquisition. So on the one hand, really powerful news coming out of the medical community with our biomedical tools, but nevertheless, really problematic sociological dynamics as we look at the groups that continue to be disproportionately impacted by the epidemic, largely due to a number of dynamics that I'm going to talk about today. So it needs to be said, injuries of inequality, of which HIV is one, produce and are produced by a socially compromised ability to protect oneself from harm. So we are at the point in the epidemic where it's not about being able to protect oneself from harm medically, it's about being able to protect oneself from harm socially. To be able to get access to the medications that I just talked about, to be able to get access to healthcare, to be in environments of safety and good health. So to look at these questions, I launched the Health Hardship and Renewal Study back in 2010. And if you look at the top left of your screen, you'll see the Sister to Sister study, the first project that I did looking at 30 Black women living with HIV. And the reason that I focused on Black women is because of the slide that you saw in terms of the disproportionate impact. About 60% of women living with HIV in the United States are Black women. During the Sister to Sister study, we conducted 2 interviews and 1 observation session where I or my research assistant went to sites where women's HIV status was known and salient. So we went to support group meetings, we went to doctors' visits, we went to activist events, we went where women were speaking, we went to social service agency visits with them, anywhere where their HIV status was known and important. important in the context of the organizational interaction. We did a subset follow-up interviews with a subset of that group in 2010 and 2015. And if you have an opportunity to read Remaking a Life, you'll see that there are some women who I call the central storytellers, whose stories we track from 2005 to 2015, over a decade of data that I was able to collect on that subset. Nevertheless, I wanted to be able to understand some comparative dynamics for women living with HIV. So at the top right, you'll see the snapshot interview study. This was a project funded by NSF and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where we looked at 84 Chicago women living with HIV of different racial, ethnic, and class backgrounds. And I'll give you a sense of the demographics in just a moment. This was conducted back in 2010, 2012, where we interviewed women for this study. And this is the project on which Alicia was a research assistant and had an opportunity to help code and analyze some of the data for us on that. And then at the bottom, you'll see the organizational lens that I brought to the project, looking at what I call the HIV Safety Net. And this is a network of national and local meaning Chicago, activists, advocates, service providers, and policy officials who I interviewed between 2010 and 2018. And what you're going to see is the role that the HIV community, the safety net, plays in the story I'm going to talk about today. So just to give a sense of the demographics for the snapshot study, you see that the majority of our respondents were Black women. You see on the far right column how that matches with the national HIV cases at the time from when we began the snapshot study. You see that we had a larger proportion relative to their share of national HIV cases of Latinx and white women, to get a better sense of what was happening and to be able to understand not just the race dynamics, but also the class dynamics playing out for women living with HIV. And during the Q&A, I welcome a question on some of the class dynamics we were able to tease out. And then at the bottom of your screen, you see that this is a group that is largely low income as you look at the annual household income of the respondents in our study. So I often begin my talks, but I begin the book telling the story of a woman named Dawn. And I've used this example because it's quite illustrative of the central sociological puzzle that is at the center of Remaking a Life. Dawn shared a quote with me that stopped me in my tracks. And she asserted, if it weren't for HIV, I'd probably be dead. Dawn was diagnosed in 1985 and was a woman who we followed over a 10-year period, beginning in 2005. And the comment that she made was quite startling to me, but it's actually a quote I would hear from several women that we would end up interviewing in both Sister to Sister and the Snapshot study. And this is puzzling. How can an illness responsible for the deaths of over 30 million people around the world be credited by Dawn for saving her life? How could an illness that is still highly stigmatizing be credited by Dawn for saving her life? And when we look at Dawn's context, we start to understand a better sense of why she would make such a statement. Dawn was dealing with many of the dynamics that drive the HIV epidemic in the US and its disproportionate impact on communities of color. Here, we're talking about structural vulnerabilities within communities and also within social networks. So we know that HIV is transmitted through exchange of bodily fluids, particularly blood and semen. We know that when we think about HIV transmission, we're looking at people's sexual networks. We're also looking at perhaps drug using networks. In some cases, we're looking at a vertical transmission, what we used to call mother to child transmission, but not as much in the US context. But nevertheless, we see Dawn dealing with some really critical dynamics in terms of structural vulnerabilities, limited healthcare and social services, limited economic resources within her community, a delayed and uneven public health and community response to the epidemic in vulnerable communities. Kathy Cohen's book, Boundaries of Blackness, talks about this in great detail. and what Michelle Tracy Berger calls intersectional stigma, the notion of experiencing stigma on the basis of multiple social categories, such as race and class and gender. The other dynamic was that Dawn was navigating what I call the sexualized drug economy. Over 50% of our respondents in the snapshot study had histories of addiction. And we also need to be reminded of our current opioid crisis, where we are also seeing pockets of HIV epidemic within communities that are dealing with opioid crises. And I write about places like Scott County, Indiana, which had a significant HIV outbreak just a few years ago, driven by the opioid crisis. So within this context, it's important to understand that, yes, people do exchange drug paraphernalia, and we're concerned about that in terms of HIV transmission, but it's always a context in which women are absolutely and largely powerless in terms of being able to dictate the terms of their sexual relationships and partnerships, whether we're talking about engagement with sex work and women's struggles to maintain equal footing within the power differential in that context, or whether we're talking about relationships within the intimate relationships within the sexualized drug economy. And Dawn was experiencing much of that. And then finally, we have to talk about what I call the afterlife of sexual trauma. According to the Center for Disease Control, nearly 1 in 5 women report experiencing rape at some point in her lifetime. In our study, and this is, remember, a study of women from diverse racial and ethnic and economic backgrounds, 1 in 4 revealed that she had been raped or molested before the age of 25. So much of what we think happens within this context is that these early sexual experiences shape the ways in which women subsequently navigate sexual relationships, whether it's difficulty advocating for oneself, whether it's difficulty navigating imbalanced power dynamics, whether it's self-medicating through drugs and alcohol and limited inhibitions. We think that all of these things, from the individual experiences of trauma to the institutional to the structural traumas that we're seeing in the ways that people are experiencing them, are what are driving the HIV epidemic. So by the time I got to Dawn and interviewed her, what I came to realize was that Dawn was not just dying from, if you will, her HIV status. Yes, when diagnosed, she explained that she interpreted it as what she talks about, and many women talk about interpreting it as a death sentence when they fully understand what it means to have HIV. They also talk about a social death in terms of the stigma and the loss of reputation that they experience or worry that they will experience as a result of their HIV status. But given the slide that I just shared, we know that Dawn was dying from many different things, not just her HIV status. She was dying from the structural, institutional, and individual traumas that she was experiencing, and all of those injuries of inequality that had been accumulating for some time, even before the diagnosis. So the question in the conversation with Dawn is her conversation with me in terms of how she went from dying from to what I call living with to thriving despite HIV. By the time I met Dawn, she had a very different story from the story that she experienced on the slide. She had been previous slide. She had been clean for several years. She lived in a place called St. Mary's that was for women living with HIV and grappling with drug addiction. She had been able to live there for several years with rent-free. And then when she did eventually move into an apartment, she was able to get a subsidized apartment. She was able to get access to physical health services, but also mental health services through her connection with St. Mary's. She was able to enter into case management and interact with someone who would connect her through and serve as an institutional broker, to borrow from Mario Small's term, to different organizations that would prove pivotal for her in terms of her ability to live with HIV and for her regular survival. But this organizational network that she was in wasn't just about survival. It was about teaching Dawn how to live and thrive despite HIV. So she became a leader in her community. She began speaking out about HIV topics, began doing speaking engagements, began lobbying, lawmakers began going to AIDS Watch, where lawmakers go to Washington and meet with public officials, sitting down eventually with Nancy Pelosi to talk about HIV policy with another group of HIV activists, and would come to become a very well-respected member of the HIV community in the city of Chicago and beyond. So for me, sociologically, trying to understand that trajectory, that movement from dying from to living with to thriving despite, is at the center of my work. And I argue that we often think about life transformations. We often think about movements that people like Dawn experience of high levels of instability to places of eventual stability, and even places of movement and mobility in one's life, as sometimes very individual events, sometimes spiritual events, religious events, as people describe it. But I would argue that they're actually sociological events, because they are negotiated processes that are influenced by the people, the places, and the public policies that we encounter. So as I described St. Mary's, we heard about the people she met, the therapist, the case manager, the medical doctor, the other women living with HIV that would be role models for her and that would eventually be her comrades within HIV support groups. We heard about the importance of a place like St. Mary, but we also have to think about the public policy that helps to fund something like that and helps to create that kind of institutional network that helps people move from dying from to living with to thriving despite. So just to put a fine point on it, I'm talking about the HIV Safety Net, which is a global network of health and social service providers, activists, advocates, researchers, and policymakers who have created and operationalized the HIV response. So we often think about the HIV safety net as healthcare focused in terms of that circle, that top circle, in terms of helping people get access to healthcare through a policy called the Ryan White Care Act, and helping people get access to drug assistance, AIDS drug assistance, through the AIDS Drug Assistance Program. But that's not all that the HIV safety net does. Through its network of care, including support groups and case management, it's actually doing much more than that. Number one, it's helping people connect to economic assistance. It's helping people to find jobs. In some cases, it's hiring people to work within the HIV safety net. It's giving people access to case managers who are helping them navigate the bureaucracy that is the Social Security system to help people get access to disability benefits if that is the determined path. So these are people who are helping women living with HIV to actually navigate towards economic stability. The HIV safety net is also offering social support. And this is often, when we have funding conversations, this is one of the most vulnerable areas as I talk to policymakers, because it's easy to underestimate just how important it is for women to have support groups, access to people that are peer advisors, that are peer mentors, who have experienced the same kinds of dying from injuries of inequality that they have, that can then help them along the path. So much of HIV care is not simply about bureaucrat and client or doctor and patient. It's about peer support where other people living with HIV are a critical part of the response. And then finally, political and civic engagement. So the idea that people living with HIV are not to be framed as recipients within the HIV care safety net, but instead actors who eventually will give back to the safety net and help to lead the larger policy debate about where we need to go next. So I watched as Dawn and many other women like her were trained to be able to use their stories for political advocacy, were invited to speaking events, were invited to come and talk to public officials to advocate for needs on their behalf. And what became really interesting to me is how women then took those skills and moved it into other arenas where we see inequities. So many of the people that were featured in Remaking a Life are now, for example, very focused on the COVID response, or they're very focused on voting rights and voter access. So the kind of core set of skills ends up being translated to other contexts in which we see inequities. So it's important to note that the HIV safety net has a very important history, and scholars have documented this history, and I just wanted to give you a visual. I write a little bit about it in Remaking a Life, but there's a really great canon that talks about HIV activism, because what's really important about the HIV community is that it's very much a safety net that was built organically from the ground up. So on the bottom left of your screen, you see the ACT UP for a Cure, and this is often how people imagine AIDS activism. ACT UP with the pink triangle, silence equals death, and the kind of activism that you saw in the film, How to Survive a Plague. That is a part of HIV activism, and it's an important part of HIV activism, but it's not the whole story. It's really what you see on this screen in terms of this mixture of people of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, different class backgrounds, men, women, non-gender conforming individuals, non-binary individuals, and people who have been pushing and advocating for the creation of the safety net for people living with HIV. Many of the people that you see on the screen are in fact living with HIV themselves and have been at the forefront of pushing the agenda to move it from the silence equals death of the earliest years and an ongoing and kind of perennial conversation to nothing about us without us, meaning policies don't get formed or should not be formed without the people most affected sitting at the table. That is a concept that I would love to see exported to other arenas when we talk about policies, particularly for marginalized populations. And then finally, this conversation around undetectable equals untransmittable, the fact that when people are able to get access to HIV medications and get to undetectable viral loads, they can't sexually transmit. So I wanted to give you a sense of the flavor of some of the people behind the building of the infrastructure that I'm talking about today. So as I think about the sociological argument that I want to make, I want to put forward what I call the sociology of the transformative project. And we know that many sociologists have actually documented what I call the transformative project without necessarily calling it as such. And I'm thinking about Lawrence Ralph's book, Renegade Dreams. I'm thinking about Edward Orozco Flores's God's Gangs. I'm thinking about Rob Sanson and John Lobb's work and Desistance of Crime over the Life Course. And what these texts have in common is that they first identified the significant environmental challenges that people are facing and the coping strategies, what I call so they identify the injuries of inequality, and then they talk about the pre-transformation survival and coping strategies, how people navigate these very, very difficult environments. And then what I argue is that at some point in a transformative project, a cognitive shift happens where the person experiencing these injuries of inequality realizes that the pre-transformation survival and coping strategies that they once used are no longer serving them. For Dawn, those survival and coping strategies included drug use, really battling with addiction. She was at one point living on the street and surviving through sex work. She was in and out of incarceration facilities. She was cycling through many of the institutions that I know your colleague and our former student at Northwestern, Armando Lara Milan, works on and talks about. So essentially, as we see people kind of navigate these very difficult structures and institutional systems, for some people, a cognitive shift happens. And for the women in my study, they used language like, I just got tired, or I didn't want HIV to take me out, or HIV was one of the many things I was handling, and I just didn't want to go out like this. So the cognitive shift happens where people have a shift in mindset in terms of how they are going to navigate the bruising injuries of inequality that they're experiencing. But that's not where the story ends. And in the conversation around personal responsibility that we often hear in our political rhetoric, the assumption is that should a cognitive shift happen, then it's a matter of the person just kind of climbing up from the bootstraps and off we go. But what I'm arguing is that the cognitive shift cannot ultimately lead to the kind of movement from dying from to living with to thriving despite that I've been documenting in Remaking a Life unless there is an institutional safety net to catch that person and to provide the resources to help that shift stick. And I have two directional arrows. Oops, my arrow on the bottom, there's supposed to be an arrow pointing back to the cognitive shift. Because what we find is for some women, they come into the HIV safety net and then they have the shift. For other women, they have the cognitive shift, and then they seek out the services of the HIV safety net. And I call the organizations within the HIV safety net framing institutions. And I've got an article with LaShonda Pittman and Jean Beeman in Social Science and Medicine that illuminates what we mean by framing institutions. But essentially, these are organizations that help people understand a new and significant life condition. So helping women to understand that HIV is not a death sentence, it's a manageable chronic illness, introducing women to resources that will be effective for them to navigate that new social status, helping women to introduce them to networks also, and helping women also to have a cognitive frame of reference to understand what this new status means. So what we were able to document is how St. Mary's and many other institutions in Dawn's life, but in the lives of other women in Remaking a Life, were actually framing what it means to live with HIV and pushing back on women's first assumption that to live with HIV means to have a death sentence. So within the kind of cadre of framing institutions, the kind of amalgamation of that is the HIV safety net. And from there, we see this movement from dying from to living with to thriving despite, and women's new remade kind of lives, their modus operandi, the way in which Dawn becomes a political activist through her story. And so many women also find new ways to get to a place of stability in terms of economic stability, social stability, health stability, and even for some women, deeper levels of political engagement. And then it's important to note that unfortunately the injuries of inequality persist. So what I'm telling here is not a story about upward economic mobility, which is often a focus of us, of our community of sociologists. We want to know, what did we see in terms of income, education, and wealth building? And what I'm arguing is, while that kind of mobility is important, we also need to think about people's mobility in terms of dying from to living with to thriving despite in transformative projects, because I submit to you that for many marginalized populations, this will be also a critical area of mobility. As I told you Dawn's story, the shift in her quality of life that comes once she kind of moves along this trajectory and plugs into the HIV safety net. I should also note that even though this kind of diagram simplifies things, we know that this is not a linear trajectory. In the book, I write about their fits and starts and moments of marked improvement, and then 2 steps forward, 5 steps back. There are ways in which the bottom falls out. And nevertheless, what I'm able to see over time through working with women longitudinally is how many nevertheless kind of move along this trajectory and ultimately get up to a place of much greater stability than where they were when they were diagnosed. So when Dawn says to us, if it weren't for HIV, I'd probably be dead, what she's really saying is, if it weren't for the HIV safety net, if it weren't for that community, if it weren't for the access to the resources that I needed to survive, resources, by the way, that I needed all along, even before my HIV diagnosis, I would probably be dead. So what is the transformative project, and how am I defining it sociologically? I see it as a multidimensional, nonlinear process by which individuals fundamentally shift how they interpret, strategize around, and tactically address struggles related to trauma and complex inequalities that affect their everyday lives. So in the book, I'm able to document how women come to shift, how not only how they understand HIV, but how they're going to live with HIV, what behaviors they're going to stop doing, what behaviors they're going to start doing, how they're going to navigate relationships and institutions differently, and how they are going to begin to put together a set of survival strategies that will allow them to live despite their HIV status. It entails the adoption of a radically different set of approaches to negotiate questions of physical, social, economic, and political survival and social mobility. So part of what I'm interested in the transformative project is the dynamic nature of how people create new kinds of coping strategies when faced with serious structural and institutional disadvantages. And then it involves altering the ways in which one engages in micro-level interpersonal interactions with meso-level institutions and neighborhoods, and with macrostructural arrangements such as public policy. So it's understanding how women shift how they interact with their everyday relationships, how they shift their navigation of institutions, and how ultimately they move through macrostructural arrangements, and particularly how they attempt to influence public policy. So when we look at the women in the snapshot study to understand how women are using the HIV safety net, whether they're using it just for healthcare resources or whether they're using it more holistically to move along this trajectory of dying from to living with to thriving despite, you see on the illustration here where we are. So in the first column, we asked women, how often, or do you visit with someone at an HIV-focused agency, group, or healthcare provider at least once every 3 months? And we had a high percentage of women who reported that they were quite connected to HIV services. And what's interesting here is that they're not just connecting for the obvious reason of medical care. They're connecting for a combination of medical care and social services. And as you look at the racial dynamic, you see that particularly for Black women living with HIV, this more holistic framework, this more holistic HIV safety net has proven to be pivotal for them in terms of their connections. So does it ultimately make a difference in terms of some of the policy dynamics that we're interested in? So in 2017, a study was done of clients who were getting access to the Ryan White program, that holistic HIV safety net. And the results showed that a higher percentage of them were virally suppressed, meaning their HIV status was managed to the point that their viral load was undetectable in the blood, which exceeded the national average among people living with HIV of 59.8%. So this suggests that the HIV safety net is not only providing really important social support and some of the more intangible things, but it's also leading to better policy outcomes and better health outcomes as well for people who are engaging with this community. So when I began to do my book tour for Remaking a Life, it was right around the time that reality TV star Jonathan Van Ness came out about his HIV status. And I wrote about that in the New York Times. And Jonathan got in touch with me and invited me to be on his podcast, Getting Curious, with Jonathan Van Ness. And I told him Dawn's story. And I told Jonathan Dawn's quote of, "If it weren't for HIV, I'd probably be dead." And Jonathan stopped me in my tracks and said, "I felt the same way." Jonathan, too, was, yes, privileged by virtue of he is a cisgender white male, but he also is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and is a survivor of drug addiction and is a survivor of a whole host of challenges that he was grappling with when he was diagnosed with HIV. And Jonathan then talked about how if it weren't for that same safety net that Dawn came into contact with, he too would have been wouldn't have been able to carry on. So part of what I think is really interesting about this story is how this safety net has figured out a way to target and respond to people of diverse racial and class backgrounds, diverse sexualities. It is not a perfect system, and there are a lot of challenges. And one of the things that I also write about in the book are the ways in which so much more needs to be done, particularly in the South, where we see a high concentration of the HIV epidemic, but we don't have the HIV safety net built out in quite the same way that we do in our major cities like Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and DC, et cetera, and how we're paying the price for that in terms of what's driving the epidemic right now are the structural and institutional dynamics that I talked about, and the fact that we're lacking, I think, the HIV safety net. And I should also point out, in the South, those are also many states that did not expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. So what we're seeing is the kind of real life consequences of what happens when people do have access to safety nets, in the case of Dawn and Jonathan Van Ness, and the realities of when people don't have access to safety nets in the context of what's happening in our continuing epidemic, and particularly its concentration in the American South. So there's an obvious paradox to all of this in terms of the HIV safety net. And it's this: access to a safety net that enabled women to achieve significant and sustained life change depended on their being HIV positive. The fire had to be raging before we installed the fire extinguisher. People essentially had to be identified as quote unquote public health threats to be able to get access to a safety net that would provide the kind of healthcare and social support and economic assistance and political and civic engagement opportunities that people had access to within the HIV safety net. And we can't forget the history of where the safety net came from, and the very key role that white middle-class gay men played in building the safety net. I showed you the slide, so you see the diversity in actuality of the safety net, but nevertheless, as my Northwestern colleague Steve Epstein so beautifully writes about, gay men really took on HIV as an existential threat. And it was both associated with them from the first cases and the first marking of HIV as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency disease, to also the gay men's willingness to take up HIV as a political cause in the wake of severe homophobia and political marginalization. So one of the things that I think is important, nevertheless, to remember is that we are still, even in that experience of marginalization, as important and severe as it is, we're also still talking about an experience of privilege by the basis of whiteness, on the basis of maleness, and on the basis of economic resources. So this is a community that was able to bring a certain level of economic and social and political capital to the fight to claim and fight for and fight hard for a seat at the table. So one of the things that I think that this highlights is the importance of taking seriously the role of both marginalization within social movements, but also the role of privilege and the role that privilege plays in pushing social movements forward and protecting the political gains that get produced as a result of social movements. And then finally, I have to point out the obvious: the continuing need for structural and institutional interventions as prevention. My overall recommendation: yes, it's important to build out the HIV safety net and continue to fortify it, not only because what it means for the health status of women living with HIV, but for all of the different injuries of inequalities that they're grappling with. But also, we've got to think about, why are they grappling with these injuries of inequality in the first place? And for us to continue to think through structural and institutional level interventions so that we can not only prevent HIV transmission, but the sexual trauma and the structural dynamics that I talked about, the lack of access to economic resources and healthcare that I talked about, all of those things absolutely need to be at the center of our focus as well. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I'm delighted to take your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Watkins-Hayes. So just to remind all of you, please, if you have a question, write the word stack in the chat and I will call on you in order. First question goes to Sibel.
Thank you, Celeste, for a wonderful talk. Hello, it's great to see you, even if only virtually. So, your talk was really fascinating and kind of, not surprisingly, I'm really interested in the kind of the policy kind of aspect of the story. The Ryan White HIV/AIDS program sounds amazing, this HIV safety net, and it's so at odds with the traditional safety net, which is riddled with holes, as you know really well, right? It's riddled with holes, it's punitive, It's meager in terms of the amount of support that it gives, and it's demobilizing politically and civically. And when we think of the more kind of generous social welfare programs in the United States, we tend to think of those as being kind of provided to people who are the wealthiest, the whitest, not Black women. So what's really interesting about this story is you've got this really generous social safety net, and Black women are oversubscribed, it seems, right, relative to Latinas and whites and multiracial populations. So how did this happen, given the kind of the normal biases of American society and American welfare policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was really the puzzle, because coming from the welfare world into the HIV world was such a culture shock for me. And I'm going to answer your question on two levels. Number one, what do I think? First of all, I think we have to acknowledge the history of the HIV community and how we can't underestimate, I think, the ways in which racial and class privilege and male privilege operated in building the HIV safety net. And again, absolutely grounded in experience of sexual marginalization and homophobia, but also I think we also have to acknowledge that piece of it, in that the level of, economic and social and political capital and the ways in which HIV activists were very, very savvy about changing hearts and minds and essentially refusing to be, to borrow Evelyn Hammond's phrase, refusing to be scripted out of the national narrative because of the devastating impact of HIV. So I think that's a big underlying overlay. And then how it becomes more diverse is that over time, as we start to realize just how diverse of a population who's actually affected by HIV, more and more of those people come into the safety net, and not just come in as recipients, but actually start to shape it, actually start to challenge the whiteness of it, the male dominance of it, the very clear class privilege that's operating. Now the HIV safety net is very much taking up the question of cisgender privilege within HIV world and thinking about where trans lives fit into that. So what the community has been willing to do, which I think too few communities are willing to do, is to constantly push back on itself and to constantly call itself out. So when I go to these meetings, there's always that kind of tension in the room in terms of who's being included, who's being lifted up, who gets to be in the leadership, but it's a part of the culture and everybody understands that it's a constructive tension. And so that they just kind of work it through, and that you see new organizational forms pop up, founded by women, founded by people of color, et cetera, so that the safety net in terms of not just the recipient base, but also who's shaping it becomes very diverse over time. But nevertheless, I do think there's some important lessons that I hope could be borrowed and transferred into those other kinds of safety nets that you talk to. Like, I do think that, yes, part of it is the magic of, or the confluence of what happened with the HIV world, but I also think that some of it's replicable. So for example, Nothing About Us Without Us, it was, and I write about this in the book, there is not an HIV meeting that I attend of researchers where people living with HIV are not at the table. It's just not done in the community. And like, for example, I'm going to be at a conference, virtual conference, Thursday and Friday, Women's Research Group on HIV. These are medical providers, physicians, these are clinicians, these are bench scientists, these are the highest of the height in terms of prestige in organizations working on HIV. Probably a third of the women there are actually living with HIV as well. And what that does in the conversation is that it holds all of us accountable as we talk about populations, as we talk about policy prescriptions, as we think about what works and what doesn't. We think about how organizations are operating and the cultures that they're proliferating. So I think that that's a huge, important accountability tool that I just spoke to a group last week that was focused on poverty for Department of Health and Human Services. And I said, if you don't do anything else, borrow that from the HIV world. Nothing about us without us. The other thing that I think is really important, Sibel, is the importance of storytelling in the HIV community. And that is to say, in our punitive safety nets, we really teach people, don't share your story. because that's used to determine what benefits you will not get access to. And the HIV world is very different. Tell us your story so that we know what you need. And I think that it creates a context where people end up owning their story and understanding how it can be powerful, not only to get themselves access to resources, but also to help others and to influence policy. So that's another kind of cultural dynamic. And then the final thing I'll say before we head to the next question is there is a tension in terms of the concerns about the way that we did see a retrenchment of some members of the LGBTQ community when the antiretroviral medications hit. In the sense that I got my drugs now, I don't have to worry about HIV anymore. And with that, taking the economic, political, and cultural capital that had been helping to fuel the safety net. And that's an ongoing challenge and issue. How do we keep this multi-racial, multi-class, multi-generational, et cetera, coalition together in light of the disparities in terms of people who now are taking a pill a day and HIV is at the recess of their mind versus for people who HIV is one of many things that they're juggling on a day-to-day basis in terms of struggle. So I hope I answered your question, but thank you for that.
Danya.
Hi, thank you so much for such a great talk. I was wondering if, I was hoping to ask you a question about the role more specific and looking more closely at the way in which this looks different for sexual minority women. And, you know, even going back to the social movement dynamics, you know, lesbians were also very active in the activism. And, you know, even prior to the HIV/AIDS crisis and the women's health movement. And I'm interested in the social dynamics. And there's also, of course, you know, the classic erasure of trans women in the kind of earliest HIV/AIDS safety networks. You know, Jonathan Van Ness is not cisgender; he's they're non-binary, and it just strikes me to look at the comparison of these groups and not see and only see cisgender men disaggregated by sexual orientation and not seeing, you know, the distinction between cis and trans made.
Yeah, I love that question. And also, yes, to your point, Jonathan Van Ness does currently identify as non-binary. When we did the interview, we talked about his, as he's transitioning in terms of how he self-identifies. So thank you for that. So I absolutely think this is part of the challenge, right? Because one of the things, and that's why I think it was helpful to see the images of part of what I want to do is join the group of scholars who are trying to disrupt the HIV narrative as a singular narrative of the kind of how to survive a plague ilk, and even how to survive a plague. You saw lesbians who are quite active. And I do think that you know, when I look at work like, you know, Deborah Gould's work and others who are, and Jenny Breyer's work, who are thinking about how to recover some of these narratives and these histories, because you're absolutely right. You know, when we think about the LGBTQ population involved in early HIV work, it was a much more diverse group, but who got put to the forefront and who got, you know, kind of given access to the rooms of power were this one kind of community of individuals. So I do think that, and particularly when I think about the work that I do with, say, the Women's Research Institute, we're thinking a lot about how we challenge that also in the current research that's happening, not just the recovery of the history, but the current research. So for example, the absence of transgender populations in clinical trials, for example, the way that PrEP was rolled out, that the clinical trials didn't include women, the ways in which we're still kind of fighting some of these battles around inclusion and in the HIV world that are still ongoing. So I think, Daniel, your question is important on two fronts. Number one, recovering the history to be able to talk about the Marsha P. Johnsons and the Sylvia Riveras and people who were active early on, and also to think about the ways in which we still see those silences play out even today when we think about a lot of the biomedical work that's being done and the continual fight that we have to include a broader array of people in clinical drug trials. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. I'm using my phone, so it looks a little bit strange. So I have two questions. The first one is, so I guess one of the reasons why HIV/AIDS receives so many resources and is very successful, not just in the United States, but around the globe, is really this type of AIDS exceptionalism. I mean, AIDS just received the level of material resources, the political sort of attention at such a level that is very difficult to replicate in many other for many other groups who suffer from other disease. And a lot of research, for example, by Rachel Best has pointed out that actually the sort of even distribution of health resources concentrating on HIV/AIDS has created this problem of people only fight for certain disease instead of the whole healthcare system, and also create like sort of inequality among people. I mean, it is like HIV can help you, but what about the other type of disease? Do they receive this kind of help? So I'm wondering, how would you sort of speak on the fact of the great progress we have already made in the HIV/AIDS area, and then the sort of how to promote the general sort of equality and health justice for everyone? That's the first question. And then the second question is, it's quite amazing the sort of you portray such a very positive picture of how people like go from dying from AIDS and even to sort of social justice sort of cause and so on. So that could remind me of work, for example, like the book The Republic of Therapy. So like for example, in Africa, there's similar sort of research done on sort of this kind of. I love what you were saying about the HIV safety network. But those research in other countries show that HIV safety network creates a lot of problems. They talk about this confessional sort of technique at peer advisors, sort of support groups, the narrative storytelling, all those things. And they draw this conclusion about this very Foucauldian sort of approach of the whole process of receiving help is also a process of disciplinary sort of effects. So I'm wondering, can you say more about what conditions in the United States that make it possible for people actually to come together to form political mobilization and so on? Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much. So part of the AIDS exceptionalism that you point to is exactly the kind of paradoxical relationship that I'm speaking about, in the sense that we have a model of what may work, but it's a model that we're not willing to shift to other areas and to use as a model for our entire healthcare system. So in an ideal world, the HIV model would then fuel our kind of national healthcare system, right? Because we're able to show measurable results in terms of what it's able to do and what's possible. But our politics don't allow for that. So what you therefore have is people trying to carve out lanes within a system that is highly unequal, and a politics that will not allow the kind of safety net to be proliferated throughout. So yes, you do see that disparity. And that's also, I think, kind of the perverse dynamic that you see within the HIV community, in that, by no means am I arguing that HIV is a good thing, but if you're dealing with high levels of marginality, this is often your first opportunity to get access to services, which is, deeply problematic, right? In an ideal world, that would level out across issues, but also, as you're pointing out, across diseases. So should we be going in that direction? Absolutely. But yes, we are absolutely in a place of that kind of exceptionalism. And I blame our political system for that. Your question about the confessional nature of that piece, and I write about that in Remaking A Life, because I write about Nana Khanna, who's the head of the Positive Women's Network, who talks about the downside of that kind of confessional approach in storytelling. And she talks about the ways in which women were being invited to these meetings just so they could say they heard from the community, right? So women would come in, and this didn't just happen with women. People would come in, share their stories, and then that would kind of be it, right? And it left people feeling like, I just shared my story, kind of what policy, what's going to change as a result? And, does it feel exploitative? Does it feel voyeuristic, et cetera? And what Positive Women's Network as an organization did was to start to train women around the terms by which they would agree to share their stories. So they have clear guidelines around, there will be an ask, at the end of me sharing my story. There will be follow-up in terms of hoping to see action as it relates to you hearing my story. And there will be pushback if I feel like I'm in an environment where the confessional nature is happening just for the sake of happening. So that's just one example of how people have tried to push back on what you're right is a system that's kind of fraught with the possibility of a performance that can be quite problematic. And then remember, I said the HIV safety net is actually not perfect. So as part of my optimism about it is, quite frankly, after studying the welfare system, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. It's doing something, but also acknowledging its continual struggles and also acknowledging that the powers that be at the top of the HIV safety net ladder are still not representative necessarily of who the vast majority of people are living with HIV, to talk about the inequities that persist within organizations, to talk about when institutions fail. And in the book, I talk about when women don't move along that trajectory, right? When they kind of stay stuck, what happened there? And one of the biggest reasons is because of institutional failure that they hit upon, where they experienced a breach in confidentiality and they never go back, where their requests for services were denied through all kinds of problematic bureaucratic channels. Not only does that mean that they don't come back to the institution, but it also often halts their progress along this kind of dying from to living with to thriving despite trajectory. I hope I answered your question. Okay.
Anne.
Congratulations, wonderful book. I think of everything in terms of, gosh, could I use this in Social 1? And so I was thinking, this is a book that really talks about what a welfare system could be if we had an effective welfare system. But I'd love you to talk about both the positive and the possible limitations of that argument. And there are really, I guess, two parts of it. One is just, if you tried to imagine all of welfare working this way, what would be the economic burden? But actually more significant to me, and this is a sort of empirical question about your own research, I'm struck a lot when I see like TV specials on, people who survived drug addiction and are now on the road to recovery and doing very well, or somebody who's formerly incarcerated and now doing extremely well, that at least in the TV shows, they're always currently employed in an organization as a counselor or an advisor or something for other people who had the same difficulties. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, in your sample, how many of these people have built a life in which they don't have to be employed within the very kinds of organizations that help them? They work somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Versus how much is it that these organizations give people all this support and rehabilitation, but to the degree that they become productive members of society, it's by treating other people or advising or counseling or whatever it is, other people who actually have the same trauma they had. And maybe that is sufficient. Maybe there could be a whole sort of economy of trauma in which, the former alcoholics help other alcoholics. And but you see the problem. So it's that sort of, how generalizable is this to a broader sense of what a welfare system could be?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anne. And that's one of the things that was a struggle for me because, as I said, what we see is not upward mobility in the way that I, as a sociologist, was looking for upward mobility. Right. So it's not that women are moving into jobs by and large that are moving them up the economic ladder. Right. Many of them are still poor, even after through the study, they were low income when we recruited them, and they are still low income and struggling to this day. So for me, one of the things that I noted was, okay, this is not a story about upward economic mobility. This is not a gain. These aren't gains in, occupation, et cetera. But it felt like another kind of mobility, right? That I had to try to theorize around. So when we think about Dawn's story, a woman who is, gets distanced from her family because of her addiction and all of the other struggles that she's grappling with, and then ends up being this kind of, significant activist, that it's a kind of mobility. And that's why I'm theorizing it as the transformative project. And exactly what you're talking about, the people who came out of prison and end up being the counselors, and drug and alcohol end up being the counselors. Transformative project, I think this is an example. I think all of those are an example of. So I think that theory is generalizable at that level. To the question of its replicability to larger welfare systems, I think that too is the challenge. It's so, it's so hard for me to imagine it in this political climate, first of all. And also, I'm going to be frank, it's hard for me to imagine it without a ostensibly privileged group claiming it. So I don't think that we get the HIV safety net without white men being out in front. If we had people who are activists who really represented who's most affected by HIV out in front, one of my respondents said, if it were about Black, we'd still be talking about this disease that's killing Black women, then nobody knows what the problem is, because the medical research and all of the funding that got pumped into it just wouldn't have happened. So my desire for replicability, number one, I think that there has to be a privileged group that is able to advocate for it somehow. And in the absence of that, I try to think about, can you get there through cultural changes? So even if they're not offering all of the economic supports that the HIV safety net offers, is there a way that they can replicate some of the cultural dynamics within the institutions? So do we have to lead with surveillance as our approach in alternative systems? Do we have to deny people seats at the table to help to determine policies? Are there those kinds of things that we can imagine that we can use until we get to better political possibility? Does that answer your question? Okay.
Armando.
Hey, Celeste, can you hear me okay?
Hi, yes.
Great, good to see you. My mind kept going to one of the findings in some of the helping institutions that are attached to criminal justice, and thinking about their effect on people's social relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking of Alison McKim has a great book about the therapeutic space, Addicted to Rehab, and they're sort of the rehab centers that are servicing sort of middle-class white women are basically encouraging them to reconnect with their families, to adopt kind of mother and wife roles and get denser ties into their networks. And then when they interact with poor Black women, they're basically trying to isolate them from supposedly kind of like toxic relationships. So as you were talking about these helping institutions as working towards transformation, is there anything on that mechanism as to people's links to their social lives and sort of pushing and pulling them in and out of those relationships? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so one of the things actually from drug and alcohol rehab that got translated into the HIV world is I have to avoid people, places, and things that in the case of drug and alcohol, threaten my recovery, and in the case of HIV, that threaten my ability to take care of myself as a woman living with HIV. So I kept hearing people use that kind of language, and I realized I had to do some investigating to figure out where did that come from, and realizing it came from Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous that moves over. So there is some of that in terms of recognizing that to move along this trajectory, some of your prior relationships, particularly relationships of abuse and I'll also say drug using, are discouraged. But what's interesting is that it's not a complete breakage of all personal ties. In fact, it is kind of a mixture of exactly what you're describing, because there is this idea that you will go back to your family and reconnect, because the notion is you've got to be there to raise your kids. And in fact, that's used as a major motivator for women to stay in care of you've got to be healthy enough to take care of your kids. And women talk about that being a major motivator. So in that sense, it's not really a separation. In that sense, it's a we want to reconnect you to family. And the other thing that I'll say is it relates to sex is unlike the welfare system that I think has a very a perverse notion of sex, meaning sex is the why you got here, and we're going to therefore penalize you for that. So don't have additional kids. We need to know like who's in your house and who's contributing to the income, et cetera. That's the history of the welfare system. The HIV world, and at least the activist-driven HIV world, works to be more sex positive. So there is this notion that intimate relationships are going to be a natural part of your life, and it's fine and it's acceptable. And in fact, it's encouraged for you to think about how do you love as a woman living with HIV. So it's, you know, and how do you become a mother if that is your desire? So for the Women's Research Institute on HIV conference that I'm going to Thursday, Friday, the whole conversation is around reproductive health and reproductive rights. So there's a kind of what you're describing, Armando, from Addicted to Rehab is actually, it's an amalgamation of both is what I would say is happening in the HIV world. I don't think it's that bifurcated.
Xavier.
Hello again. Thank you very much for the talk. Thank you for like this very sort of rich analysis. I had a sort of a very brief question, but it's related to your framing of transitioning to like living with, to thriving despite. And when I'm thinking about sort of like the sort of physical embodiment of particular stigmas, even though HIV is sort of more invisible in a lot of ways, unless of course it's communicated to particular bodies, and we're still dealing with this contradiction of having all of this support despite the stigma. I always go to start thinking about maybe more like critical disability studies and how we start to perhaps like reinscribe a particular sense of normality. And I was struck by the comment that you just made, I believe a couple questions ago, where you had said that there needs to be a group that's sort of leading the charge, a privileged group. Mm-hmm. And so it seems that there are those who are thriving and then those who are thriving despite. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you could speak a bit more on sort of like the multi-dimensional nature of stigma management, and mm-hmm. do we run the risk of sort of reproducing a particular set of stigmatized bodies mm-hmm. in the pursuit of more universal resources through the form of public policy, grassroots organizing, and whatnot?
Right. Great question, Xavier. And I will say, yeah, this is my pessimistic take on the need for more privileged bodies, because I think I'm just in a more pessimistic place about our politics right now. But nevertheless, what's so important though is, you know, and let me amend this comment, although it may have to be more privileged bodies in terms of some of the visibility, the work getting done and the conversation around what needs to happen, I think is best served when it's a very diverse set of voices at the table. And in an ideal world, those diverse voices could be in any powerful room, regardless of who's in office, who's in administration, et cetera. But I remember during our last presidential election, not the one that elected the current president, but the previous president, such a sense of despair in the HIV world, and such a fear that all of the gains are going to be lost. And I think that vulnerability persists within the HIV world. So the other thing I want to say to your question is, even though there's been some effective policy gains, there's also a sense of vulnerability in terms of can it last or will it last, depending on who's in office. But your point about critical disability studies and the idea of stigma management, say a little bit more about that. Help me understand the question a little bit better.
Oh, yes, of course. So like there's sort of like these two sort of competing schools of thought in disability management, where on one side, we think about how people are living with disabilities in like mm-hmm. the broader social context, But then the other sphere is more so about like how society produces disability.
Right.
Like by being inaccessible, by not having the resources and support necessary to have people who have different ways of moving, different ways of being, be it like chronic pain, be it an amputation or anything like that, and how they are like actually stigmatized because the society produces said stigma, because it's only produced for a particular type of body, per se. So that's sort of like where I was coming from in that regard, to sort of think about like, where might you sort of like fall in these sort of these conversations? And of course, this is not me asking you to speak on a literature that you may not have delved like really deep into, but I'm curious to see like any like initial thoughts about this like dichotomy and like how disability and the embodiment of stigma might play out in these particular contexts.
Yeah, I think, I totally connect to this question now. So thank you for that question. So I think what's part of what's interesting, therefore, is the question of, are we trying to eliminate the HIV status, or are we trying to eliminate the dynamics that create the HIV status? And I think that, unfortunately, we tend to focus on eliminating the HIV status, right? So ending transmission without necessarily thinking critically about the dynamics that are fueling HIV transmission, that also turn out to be some of the same dynamics that are fueling a whole host of other illnesses and challenges, both mental and physical. So I think what I would say to your question is, for me, I'm really interested in the preventative aspect, but I'm also quite taken with the more pragmatic question of what's working in our current environment, such that this population, despite their disability status or given their disability status, nevertheless has access to really important life-saving resources. I hope I answered your question, but I probably have to think about it a little bit more. Fantastic question.
Okay, we've got about 4 minutes left, so we'll take one more question. Kidi.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk and a wonderful project in general. So my question circles a little bit the same terrain as previous questions about how we can think of the welfare system in light of the HIV safety net, but with a specific question that puzzles me. So one of the things that's really striking about the HIV safety net, and which seems to be core to the good it provides to people in remaking their lives, is that it seems to give them not just support, but also ownership, right? Involvement and ownership. I thought at first, it's because it is, operated by people with HIV for people with HIV. Okay, but if we think about the welfare system, as you documented in your previous book, there is also the welfare system, especially the devolved welfare system made up of nonprofits, is also staffed by people who have fairly similar experiences to their clients and share also the common injuries often of race, and if not poverty, at least near poverty. But in that case, it doesn't seem to secrete the same kind of compassion, solidarity, and effectiveness in help. Just as often, it also secretes kind of boundary making, intragroup contempt, etc. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the specific kind of institutional logics that make it so that biographical proximity, right, works in such different ways across these two systems. And second, I was wondering if, in terms of thinking about frames that could help secrete that solidarity and that the reworking of how the safety net works, what you think of the lens of trauma, which is now quite pervasive, right, across social services, as trauma-informed services migrate from the world of healthcare to the world of social services, and whether you see that as a lens that may transform these relationships in the welfare system.
Yeah, that is such a great question. And the comparison that you draw between my two books in terms of how people who have the lived experience or who have had the lived experience move into the service role and the very different dynamics. And I think a lot of it comes down to the kind of organizational culture of how people are identifying. So for a woman living with HIV, whether she is a recipient of services or she is the organizational head, she's still a woman living with HIV. Part of what it drives that dynamic within the welfare system is I am no longer where you were. And in order to no longer be where I had to do all of these different things. And it's used in more of a punitive way, as a form of kind of punishment and surveillance as the quote unquote motivator. And I think that is part of the distinction that's made. I think that there is and also I also think the relationship to the state is different, where in the welfare context, it's understood that we're operating for the state, right? We work for the state government. In HIV world, even if you're working for an organization that's funded by the state, there's a way the ethos still understands itself as working for the community as a even if it's not a grassroots operation, right? And there's a level of accountability back to the community, which is very, very different. And this goes back to the critical role that activists play. So there is a clear sense that whatever happens within organizational walls is accountable back to the activist community, who will be very local in its pushback. And I think that also helps to shape and frame an ethos. Part of my challenge and frustration with the welfare world is that there's not as much accountability. There's accountability to the state and to the federal government, but there's not a sense of felt accountability to the community. And I think that's where you start to see the tension play out in terms of what happens when people don't necessarily feel accountable in the same way. And the whole purpose of the exercise is to move you away from who you are, right? We don't want you to be low income. So we're asking you to do all these things, where for HIV, it's you will always be a woman living with HIV. Let's help you live in a way that that is supportive. That's probably how I would respond to that. And Brad, I didn't get to your question, but I'm happy to stay for a few minutes and answer it if you'd like. I know people may have to drop.
No worries. No, I understand people's time. So whatever is comfortable with you is fine with me. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to just stick on Zoom. I don't think they'll kick us off.
It won't be a long one.
Hopefully.
Wonderful. Okay, so please join me in thanking Professor Watkins-Hayes, and sure, if people want to stick around on Zoom and continue the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for the outstanding questions. Berkeley Sociology, you do not disappoint. Thank you for the really wonderful questions. Thank you, and everyone. It's so great to see you, and thank you for the nice words about my work. I appreciate it.